I pushed that sickly substance in, not knowing if I'd wake up, blacked out for days in amnestic haze, yet over in an instant. For sleep she is a lying friend who offers no reprieve. As soon as I nod off to bed, I awake with no dreams. School started the next day. I would show up to classes, but never did any work. I kept to myself as much as possible, but once my humanities class started a group paper, I stopped showing up to that class. I didn't want group work delegated to me that I knew I wouldn't even start. It didn't matter that a solo project wasn't an option. I figured I would push all my work off until the last possible moment, like every other time, and it would work out like every other time. And in other classes, I would nod off out of boredom for the majority of the period, and then at some point wake up enough to start angrily writing my thoughts in a notebook. Almost every night I was getting high on something, and my barriers to shooting lessened enough to where I went to a pharmacy to get needles. I knew how to shoot, even though I hadn't done it before, but I wanted to double check because injecting comes with risk of infection. It's impossible to know what was actually in the ketamine I had been using, but it gave enough of an effect for me to be fairly confident injecting wouldn't be terribly risky. It was one of my Friday nights. I had a supply of distilled water I used for a neti pot, which would be perfect for injection. I wiped down a spoon and then torched the back to evaporate the left-behind alcohol, hopefully it now being sterile, drop 50 milligrams of ketamine, and then dispense a small amount of water to dissolve everything. I stir with the syringe and then use a Q-tip as my cotton filter. I wipe down a spot on my mid-thigh and wait for it to dry. My heart was pounding. I was nervous about getting an abscess, but I also knew I was stepping through a gateway by doing this. After a few minutes of staring at myself, I pinch a large patch of my leg and stick. I let go. It didn't hurt. I depress the syringe and feel a slight sting as the liquid saturates my muscle. It'll still take a few minutes to feel anything, so I get up to bandage myself before returning to my bed to lie down. Everything felt different. Normally, while snorting, the high is concentrated in my head, but now it was all in my body. It was intense, but not as mentally inebriating. I rolled around on my bed in euphoria and stared at the distortions appearing on my walls. I felt like an alien. September 4th, 2021, 2:16 a.m. I know this idea is from somewhere else, but I feel like a voyager on the Master's mission who keeps messing up and getting sidetracked by his own desires. Shooting is different because you are satisfying the needs of the body. Very earthly, fleshly, like placating someone. I want to show what is true by living in the false, but I'm afraid I'll die before I get the chance. Is this all a scheme to know everything, to be relatable, artificially put myself into situations that aren't me, but I have no idea who I am? It all relies on other people. I feel like I'm on the verge of waking up out of something. Because I see myself as the basement, a point where others could wind up, and if I can handle myself, they can too. The issue isn't that other people can't handle me, it's that I can't handle myself. I can come to these realizations, but they have no bearing on application. I still have no idea what to do, but I want to close the book on chapter 1, and I need to embrace the consequences because after,
it would have been for the best.
What Chapter 1 is, specifically who, remained constantly on my mind in an unprecedentedly crushing way. After that, I would get the desire to shoot in the middle of class, not seeking the effects of any drug, just the self-destructive feeling of sticking something in me. Whenever I felt out of place, seeing other people functioning and able to interact with others made me fantasize about bleeding out in the corner of the room where no one would notice or care.
Is there something fundamentally different about me? Is this amount of cynicism really that abnormal, and other people don't even notice the things I nitpick? Is life inherently satisfying to them? I can't even comprehend that system. It feels like the personality of a golden retriever, always smiling, having fun, full of energy, seemingly unable to feel anything other than positivity. People who put out there, "You are loved, you are beautiful just the way you are," don't care about what other people think. Do they honestly believe that? Is it not just a set of platitudes to them? It seems so foreign that I doubt it's even real. The apparent fakeness of it makes it not appealing. Misery is compelling to me because I feel like it's real. I have experience in prolonged darkness, but not the same with joy. I don't even entertain that possibility.
About a week later, I started looking into potentiators, which increased the felt effects of a drug. They were something I had known about, but never really attempted outside of small amounts of grapefruit juice that never added much to the experience. I was wary of taking large amounts because there's going to be more risk when you interfere with your body's way of processing chemicals. But when on a scouring session, I saw that piperine, from black pepper, inhibits one of the enzymes responsible for metabolizing DXM. It could be as easy as running the pepper mill into a small bowl and putting the powder into gel caps. So one Saturday night, I fill 2 gel caps with pepper and take my standard dose of 6 marshmallows to see how I would feel. All of a sudden, a message appears in the group Discord chat. Someone needs help with calculus homework. It's my time to shine. By the time we organize to meet up, the effects have taken hold, and I'm disappointed. It's not enough, so I take 4 more. My task was to explain the mean value theorem. My calculus teacher had a good practical example that I remembered. Some tollways have open road tolling where you drive under a scaffold at speed without having to stop, which allows for automatic speeding tickets. But they aren't measuring speed as you drive underneath. They get 2 timestamps when you enter and exit the tollway, and because the speed of the car is continuous and differentiable, it can't instantly jump to another speed. It can be inferred what average velocity would be required to go between the 2 toll booths based on their distance apart. If this average is above a certain threshold, a ticket can be given because at some point the car had to be traveling at least the average speed. I knew that I knew the content, but it was a challenge to get the words out in a coherent way. I was having a great time, but I knew how messed up I was. The effects became so strong I had to step away from my computer for a while to go lay on the bathroom floor. I returned shortly to finish helping with homework and then went to the bathroom again.
It feels like a betrayal when I write songs of change and I find myself in the same spot. And I know myself to be no one else, still the same years later, choosing to continually sear yesterday into tomorrow. I'm sorry for the failure. I can't be what you want me to be, but I can be a failure. It's what I'm best at.
The nausea was really getting to me. It always makes me feel like I'm dying. There's a strange headspace associated with being sick that has psychedelic hints, even when not high. There's a lot of fear around throwing up. I hadn't in over a decade.
If I died tonight, I would have done nothing. I abused my gifts and everything given to me. What a shit way to die on DXM. I'm trying to help people out through short bursts of normalcy while behind the scenes I'm dying on the floor. I think I need someone to hold me accountable. I don't think I need to feel death again. This is it.
Eventually, the sense of doom faded, and I was able to get off the floor. About an hour later, I started to feel great. Too good. And I start to wonder, could this be serotonin syndrome? It is possible with TXM, and I had messed with my body's ability to properly process the drug. I wasn't dissociating much anymore. I felt great. I was getting hot flashes. I was starting to shake, and I was surprisingly calm given the situation. The euphoria kept growing along with my body heat. I went to the bathroom and started the bath, running my forearm under the cold water while I sat on the floor. It didn't help how hot I felt. Now I had to figure out what I was going to do with myself. Trevor was out of town, and I was alone in the house. If I wanted help, I would have to get it myself. Still, I wasn't feeling very concerned, which is what concerned me. I felt too good for what was happening. I got up from the floor to try and find information on serotonin syndrome, but I was so messed up that it wasn't possible to retain anything I read, let alone comprehend it. Back to the bathroom, now with my phone, I stared at it for a while, thinking, am I really going to call an ambulance for myself?
I think I'm overdosing.
She asked for my address and what I had taken. I explained as much as possible, the DXM, the piperine, serotonin syndrome. She asked if anyone was around and if I could make it outside. And there I was, on my front step at 4 a.m. waiting for EMS. The fire department showed up first. There's a station right around the corner. They sat me on the back of the truck and started asking me questions. It felt like 5 people were talking to me and all expecting answers to their individual questions at the same time.
He's barely responding.
I was starting to doubt the seriousness of my current condition. They asked if I wanted to go to the hospital. My blood pressure was high.
I don't know. It would be safer if you did.
I agreed it would be better, so I followed them to the ambulance. I had never been in an ambulance before.
Are you going to contact my parents? Are you 18? Yes. You're an adult. Only you can disclose that.
Nothing felt real. Is this really happening? Is something actually happening? My usage reaching the point of hospitalization was momentous enough for me to realize the fact, but I separated it from myself. It was a mistake. Already I began conjuring up how good of a story this was going to be after this was all over. As I looked around the ambulance, I saw a box of face masks. I knew how bad hospitals were, so I asked for one. When we reached the emergency room and the doors swung open, it was like I stepped into another world. I still felt great. I couldn't take it seriously. There were people in stretchers scattered around the room, and the scene made me feel at home. One guy rose up from lying down, scanned the room, and yelled,
"You can't keep me here. No one is coming to get me."
No one even looked in his direction, and he lied down without speaking again. I turned to the paramedics waiting with me and apologized for doing this. After a few minutes, a young resident took me to an EKG machine. As he was hooking me up, he started asking questions.
"So, what did you take?" "Cough syrup."
Whenever I talk about my DXM use with people, I say cough syrup for simplicity.
"Oh, that stuff's not good for you, man. Codeine?" "No, I mean DXM. I combined it with piperine because it's an enzyme inhibitor." "Are you a med student?" "No, electrical engineer."
The pads were on now, and he started the test.
"Were you at a party?"
I didn't respond. I just laughed. My heart was fine. I gowned up and was taken to a bed. Actual treatment I wouldn't get for a while. While lying in bed, I tried to make out what the nurse was looking at on the computer in front of me. I wasn't confident in my comprehension at the time, but she was looking at a medical journal on piperine. Eventually, I got a saline drip with midazolam. Administering benzos is really all you can do in this situation. They're waiting on my blood work to get back to determine the severity. Serotonin syndrome harms by the tremors of muscle overactivity heating up your body so much that your muscle cells break down and enter your bloodstream. The doctor arrives with the labs.
"Have you done this before? Do you know what bad trips are?" "No, this feeling was fundamentally different. I'm familiar with bad trips."
He took his fingers and hit the nerve beneath my kneecap, and my leg really kicked.
"Yeah, overexcited. Probably a mild to moderate case of serotonin syndrome."
I got a prescription for lorazepam to take the following few days, and soon after was let go. In total, I was only there 4 or 5 hours. Now, I had to figure out how to get home. I wandered around aimlessly for a while, not even particularly looking to leave or go anywhere, just to walk around. They had taken me to UIC, which was near a train station. The benzos allowed me to wait on the platform without concern over what happened. The only passing thought I had was that it's interesting today's 9/11. I wasn't even concerned about telling my parents. For a change, since it was so early in the morning, I had to wait for them to wake up. There was no extreme reaction, but there was concern. I explained what I had taken, serotonin syndrome, and the lorazepam prescription. I told them I was getting rid of what drugs I had left. That was something I had already decided on while in the hospital, but I knew it was something they wanted to hear. For the entire situation, what put them off the most was the fact I had to call an ambulance for myself because I was alone. After ending the call, I gathered everything hiding around my room. It wasn't the first time I had tossed my drugs. I knew the procedure. My go-to method was to dump everything into one cup and fill it with diluted bleach to hopefully destroy everything. Then I would go out into the street to pour the mix into the nearest storm drain. Before doing this, I had laid out everything drug-related on a table and sat beside it with the EKG pads and IV gauze still on me. And I took a picture. And, I guess here's the sobriety with a healthy serving of bleach.
Soup.
I was hoping this experience would bring about some change in my life, but I didn't feel any different. The hospital visit had almost no impact besides me tossing my drugs. There were no feelings around it. Still miserable and unmotivated to do anything. I was disillusioned with my indifference. The unsatisfied void was still sitting in my head, where there's constant boredom and disinterest in everything, and knowledge that there isn't anything that will fill this void. That I had put myself in this place, and I was responsible for getting out. But I didn't know how, and I didn't even want to. All I wanted was for everything to stop.
I tried to convey a message without words, but all I gave was a cold embrace. Honestly, it was worse than saying nothing. I should have never began when I despised myself, but I was blinded by unfounded optimism. Somehow I both go through mood swings and feel nothing at the same time. You found me in a short period of change where I could still hold on to the novelty that I desperately seek, and I crashed like I do every time, unable to escape the thoughts of how much I hate myself, how I'm not good enough, and how I want to push people away for their own good. Yet I endlessly fall prey to the same cycle while dragging a new face along the scorched earth I leave behind. Even when I know I can't stop. I desire belonging forbidden to someone like me because I myself deny the possibility. But I need to self-harm. Refusing myself the need to prove the inevitability of my shittiness is impossible. Forgetting doesn't work. It always returns worse than before. The issue is that my everyday state progressively deteriorates to where I have no idea of how bad it really is. In brief clarity, I can see things for how they really are, and it only serves to bring me further down. This manifests itself in poignant outbursts when I can't contain the thought loops anymore, and I begin to destroy everything that's good, all for the purpose of putting me in a blight that I think I deserve, all being meaningless, putting me in the same place I've been before, never changing, never allowing myself to move on, and all the while, especially hurtful to those who for some reason do find themselves to care. I've wasted so many significant opportunities to change that I've given up on my ability to do so.
There was one class where I hadn't shown up for the lab the entire semester. I assumed I could do them at home because the software was provided to download on your personal computer, later finding out that graded attendance had been taken each session and it was now past midterms. A passing grade is needed in labs in order to pass the class as a whole, regardless of your overall grade. The irreversible self-destructing sirens were going off in my head at the prospect of failing a class, so I looked for any way out. I decided to talk to the professor after class. I was uncertain as to what I should say. I considered bringing up my hospital visit out of the gate for the easiest way out, but I never did. After I explained my situation of having 2 homework assignments completed and no labs attended, he shared his own experience as a self-admitted procrastinator, how he struggled to find motivation in college. He gave me the strategy of setting a timer. The hardest part is getting started, so set a timer and work for 10 minutes. Then, if you want to stop, stop. The point is, you will almost always continue to work. He asked me what I wanted to do, what I wanted to do with a degree, and if I wanted to be in school. Should I be in school? What things were important to me? Life plans were not thought about except for how awful the future was going to be. At that point, I was attending school only out of the momentum from high school. There was no excited anticipation as to what my career would be. It was a purposeless means of earning money, a job. What I felt, but never said, is from my brief experiences working a desk job, I saw myself apathetic and middle-aged, returning home from work on no particular day to kill myself once I didn't care to continue living. But I was able to get the point across on purposelessness. We talked a few times afterwards. He was exceptionally generous with his time. Multiple occasions we stayed for longer than an hour after class, and I never felt rushed. This being a class starting at 5 o'clock meant that by the time we left, it was dark and long after when he should have been home. He asked me to finish one homework assignment and then check in with him the following week to review how I felt. But I never tried. It took 2 weeks post-hospital visit to order more drugs. I didn't give benzos a real try, was the thought. Only taking the clonazepam once before tossing it, and in such a small dose I didn't feel the effects. This time I got a larger quantity, 150 milligrams of bromazolam solution in propylene glycol. The bottles it came in were similar to vape juice squeeze bottles, which helped because I could suck the output into an oral syringe. My oral syringes had been thrown away after the hospital visit, so I ordered another bag. Bromazolam has around 80% the potency of alprazolam, or Xanax, so I started with 1 milligram to gauge my reaction. I didn't feel much aside from emotional blunting. Typically, when I would use drugs, I wouldn't redose. It was always at least a day between, but benzos were different. After the first night, I tried doubling the dose to 2 milligrams and still didn't feel much, so I added another milligram an hour or two in. As the days went on, I would continually push the boundaries of my previous maximum dose, and then on one of these nights, I put a syringe up my butt. There wasn't any benefit to this route of administration. Benzos have such a high oral bioavailability it makes other methods mostly pointless unless the onset duration is what you're looking to reduce. But the onset and bioavailability is similar to snorting, and since I couldn't snort a liquid, this was an easy option. The 1 milliliter syringes are smaller than a pinky finger, and it only has to go up between 1 and 2 inches. The syringes came individually wrapped, so when I was done, I put them back in the wrapper to prevent it from touching any surface, which would be akin to rubbing my colon on the bathroom sink. I had no rationale for boofing different drugs, especially those as inconsequential as caffeine and melatonin. It was simply a habit formed due to having oral syringes laying around with no other use case, and the hope that maybe things would feel better this way. The typical night involved me starting with a benzo boof before moving on to redosing orally. Different syringes, of course. I'd write down whenever I took more, lining scrap paper with 2s, 2.5s, 1.5s, and 3s. Much later, I dig a page out of my desk that said, 10 milligrams vermazolam, which is a lot. Took caffeine to counteract some. Around 100 to 150 milligrams. I didn't remember writing that one. One morning, I woke up thinking, how long has it been since I got these? I had just finished the second 50 milligram bottle the night before. For some reason, I kept the box the vermazolam was shipped in, which I had tossed on the floor of my closet. As I read the label, I saw it hadn't been a month, and I had gone through 100 milligrams. Even if I was doing it every day for a month, that averages 3 milligrams. But it hadn't been a full month, and I hadn't been doing it every day. My average was closer to 5 or 6 milligrams in the instances where I did use. At these amounts, I couldn't stop altogether and would have to taper down. This was not an issue. I never got much enjoyment out of benzos. Each night, I would hope for different results, which drove the redosing. If I took more, then it might work. But I never remembered the results of the previous experience. There wasn't any euphoria or relaxation. It would knock me out and make me forget everything. Bromazolone had a reputation for being worse on memory than other benzos. With this, my mind turned to the lorazepam left over from my hospital visit. I could taper on an actual benzo with fewer memory effects, but when I looked in the medicine bin for the prescription, it was gone. I was convinced Trevor had taken it from me after the hospital visit. Now I was going to have to tell him about what I had been doing to get it back. Conveniently, I soon heard his door open as he went to the bathroom halfway through sleeping.
What did you do with the lorazepam?
Apparently, he had taken it recently. I had been wandering around the apartment at night, clearly destroyed for some time, and he was trying to figure out what I was on. There were a few instances where I knocked on his door and attempted to talk to him mid-blackout. On one occasion, I was slurring my words so much that he threatened to call the police, with me only responding, "No." The other notable one, I showed up at his door with his huge Tupperware bowl of pasta salad.
Trevor, can I have your pasta salad? Sure.
And then I slithered out. The next morning, he saw in the sink that I left him an empty bowl. My parents called. They had been checking in on me more often since the hospital visit, mostly to see how I was feeling, but near the end of this call they asked, which they hadn't before, if I was still using anything, and I bluntly said yes. I had been taking a heavy course of benzos and had to taper off it now. I said I probably needed to look into treatment somewhere as it would help me get out of school on medical leave. And while my motivations for seeking treatment were primarily to get out of the school semester on extraordinary circumstances, I also knew I was imploding. My mom said she would check with the insurance to see where I could go and what was covered. From there, we talked regularly as she went through the process of admitting me. During these calls, I was so disconnected that I didn't care what I said or how they would react because everything was neutral. She said it seemed like she cared more about this than I did, and I flatly agreed. It wasn't a concern to be physically dependent on benzos or that I was failing out of school. It just was. I told them I was planning on buying diazepam so I could taper on that instead because it had less memory effects. It only made sense to me. I needed to taper. Bromazepam led to reduced short-term memory, so tapering on something more typical for benzo withdrawal would be better. I could buy it online, and then I would be done. I didn't like benzos. I had no desire to continue using. But no one I explained this to liked my plan. It took much longer than it should have to start treatment because I refused to be inpatient. I had no desire to board somewhere, sharing a room with someone else and having no escape. So we had to look for a day program where I could go home. She was able to find a place downtown that had daily partial hospitalization program, PHP as it is called. It was in one of the old Art Deco skyscrapers with two gilded Hellenistic figures on the elevator doors which would dramatically greet me each morning. On the first day, I had to check in with a doctor where blood work was taken, both as a means of health diagnostics and drug testing, so I informed him it was going to pop for benzos. They also took my weight. I hadn't measured myself in years, so I asked what it was, but he said he couldn't tell me because they treated eating disorders there. After that, I was led into the main meeting room. At the start of each day, we would meet here for announcements, a community meeting, and the first group session. You would also meet with an individual counselor a few times a week, and after the initial meeting, you would be assigned to different groups if those issues were pertinent to you, like an eating disorder group or substance group. Most of the day was heavily worksheet-based. Psychoeducation lectures where the patients had little feedback or interaction with the material apart from listening, writing, and answering token questions. I started on one worksheet that was a distress list, where you list stressors and the respective SUDS rating, which stands for Subjective Units of Distress Scale. But after listing out a few things like public speaking, checking messages, being criticized, making mistakes, I lost interest because these weren't new discoveries. The sheet was simply listing and rating, nothing else. So I started to write on the back of the sheet why this program won't work for me.
I have some objections, or I'm not convinced of certain things. I don't have a purpose. I'm not convinced that loving yourself is a good thing. I like feeling terrible. I don't particularly enjoy life. I don't think I will be able to self-derive a purpose because of these things. And with no purpose, I feel no drive to improve. I think these questions are too large to ignore, to the extent where I'll push off lessons in group because they don't apply to someone who doesn't care about themselves. Most of the time, I have no reason to improve. The few moments where something valuable does happen are only brief instances in an otherwise jaded worldview. I only derive purpose from other people. I give no mind to what I feel on a large scale because I doubt the sincerity and reality of those feelings. I don't feel alive like the way I faintly remember, whereas I assume everyone else still feels that way. The reason why I'm even here is because I can know objectively that my habits lead to destruction, but I can't feel like that is true. So I defer to a past self that I assume had my best interests in signing up for this, even if I feel like the whole thing is meaningless. I've already written a lot about these feelings a long time ago, and it's tiring to keep rehashing the same things into print. That's why I don't have many current or new thoughts. That, and I'm withdrawing.
The open group sessions where people simply talked I found the most helpful, just by relating to other people. But there were almost no group sessions on weekends, with the day being loaded with more worksheets and the occasional art therapy. This was because on the weekends, the staff was a completely different and reduced set of workers, so there were no individual counseling sessions or meaningful group therapy. During our community meetings, dissatisfaction with the weekends was often brought up because they seemed pointless. Apparently, a 7-day program was unusual. Typically at other places, Sunday was your day off, making Saturday your only blow-off day, but we had to show up for 2. I felt most comfortable and engaged in these moments, where other people were talking openly about their frustrations. There was a level of unreality in me being there. I didn't feel like I was a patient, but an observer watching other people go through treatment. My issues were not theirs, and this psychoeducation stuff wasn't going to help. The problems I had were base level, and I was not convinced CBT and DBT skills could speak to them. During that first week, I spoke with the psychologist, whom everyone there met with infrequently. Bromazolam had to be explained. Clarified that I did mean bromazolam instead of bromazepam, which is an actual medication. She told me she would look into it, but I knew there wasn't much information out there apart from the scare articles that are put out any time a new drug shows up in a coronary report. In total, we spoke for about 30 minutes as I went through some of my mental health symptoms. By the end of each day, I would be shaky. The last hour and the train ride home, it was all I could think about. There are these brain zaps where every mental process went blank and restarted, only for a second, even some of my muscles. If I was holding something at the time, I would involuntarily drop it as the right side of my body lost function. This caused me to break a few glasses while doing the dishes, it reaching a point where I didn't care about another broken glass, I just expected it. It wasn't a good idea to take my daily dose in the morning. Besides the fact it would mentally impair me, I needed to save it for after treatment so I could have the ability to fall asleep and stay asleep without shaking. I was taken out of the morning session to see the psychologist. She said I probably had cyclothymia and that if I wasn't on benzos, she would have started me on lamotrigine. This then led to her telling me I couldn't stay for the long term because I was actively using, and I would be better served in a dual diagnosis program somewhere else that knew about bromazolam. I was annoyed that she was refusing me because, in my mind, all benzos were nearly identical, and what else was I supposed to do at this point other than to continue using at progressively lower levels? You didn't need experience specifically in research chemical benzos in order to make a taper plan, and there wasn't going to be anyone else out there who was an expert in bromazolam. It felt overly cautious and dismissive of a situation I didn't see as special. While before being informed I couldn't stay, I was dismissive of their methods. Now I was entirely checked out. I talked to no one outside of sessions. I hid and worked in corners, ate lunch by myself, and wasn't a part of any groups. Sometimes during the initial morning meetings, someone would announce it was their final day, and people would congratulate them and say they would be missed. But there wouldn't be any announcement that it was my last day. No one knew who I was. I would be forgotten, and that's all I wanted. Occasionally they gave us breaks, and I would leave to wander around outside in Millennium Park. Otherwise, if I stayed, I had nothing to do. Nothing to look at on my phone, and I didn't want to choose between self-consciously acting as if I was doing something on my phone or 1,000 yards staring at the blank wall in front of me. So I walked the perimeter of the park as fast as I could to cover the most distance and make it back before the break ended. I never brought my coat because I wanted to feel the cold shock of December. It woke me up, and I wasn't thinking about how the people around could look at me. I was thinking about the cold. My individual counselor tried to help as my time there was soon running out. We met daily as we worked through what the next best step would be. He gave me a list of dual diagnosis programs when I eventually left, but after calling, they all wanted to admit me, which still was unacceptable. So, apart from attending and then leaving the mental health facility, the whole month was spent waiting around as I self-tapered. My plan was to taper fast, which was easier for me to do because I hadn't been using heavily for long, starting at 2 milligrams daily and then going down half a milligram about each week. There are no issues with that process, but it left me uninterested in doing anything, being in a perpetual haze of benzo come down with no school, no activity, and rarely leaving the house. I wasn't looking into treatment or calling any places, which concerned my mom, leading her to take up the task. Eventually, in early December, she found a place that was willing to admit me as an outpatient. By then, I was completely off benzos, but that didn't mean I was done with drugs. For a long time, I had thought about and thoroughly researched how to extract DMT from mimosa bark. I had most of the materials from when I planned to extract propylhexedrine. I never got around to that because of my brief stint of sobriety post-overdose, but that left me with naphtha and muriatic acid under my sink, slowly corroding away the slim resistance I was putting up. It wasn't long before I was searching in the hardware store for drain cleaner to complete the recipe. It happened on a Tuesday, the day which Trevor is at work the longest. On Tuesdays, he goes in an hour early for the weekly restock, coming back at 11:30 at night. I figured I would have plenty of time and also a good excuse. We had been meaning to clean out the fridge for a while now, and I had offered to finally do it before he left for work. This would give me an alibi for moving things around and the strange smells that would emanate from the kitchen. I had been putting my root bark package through cycles of refreezing in the days preceding my extraction. This breaks down the cell walls of the plant and increases yields. A purple bag of powder left out in the open would be very noticeable to someone who was often in the freezer. Trevor had been eating the same frozen meatballs for the past week, so I hid the bag in the corner of the freezer underneath a bag of mixed vegetables I knew he would never touch. The process started with boiling the massive bark in a mixture of vinegar and water. This was done 3 times, each cycle requiring 2 hours in order to get the most DMT out of the bark. The bark was reused with each batch, and the liquid was consolidated into a larger pot that was further reduced. The problem I ran into was filtering out the bark from the liquid. I was using coffee filters, but I had no way to suspend the filter to allow for the liquid to drip through into a container. What ended up happening was I would slowly add liquid to a filter I kept in the palm of my hand, then I would gently squeeze the liquid out of the filter once I had formed it into a makeshift tea bag. This was a miserable process of the filter bag repeatedly bursting open and shooting brown goop all over my clothes, the counter, and onto the floor, leaving a smell of vinegar and mothballs. It happened many times for each batch, and by the time I'd filtered out everything, my hands were covered in acidic bark mass. Eventually, I got sick of dealing with the filters, so I picked up the remaining solid and squeezed. I was frustrated with the whole process, especially with it being all over me, and I vowed to never do this again, especially for an expected yield of a single gram. Once everything was collected and the mass disposed of, the liquid was poured into a large glass jar. I added lye to the jar in order to increase the pH to prepare for the naphtha extraction. The naphtha was a clear liquid that reeked of fuel and made me dizzy as I got closer to the container. This effect was even worse when I finally had to pour it out of its tin. It didn't matter that I was wearing a mask, the oven fans were on, and the windows were wide open to the winter air. Even though the jar had a seal, when I shook the mixture, some would spill out onto my hand, covering it in base. I could feel the soapy texture instantly. I wasn't too fond of having a gasoline mixture with a pH nearly 14 slowly destroying my hands, so my process of shaking involved multiple rounds of hand washing interspersed. Given enough time after mixing, the naphtha will begin to settle out on top of the water, exactly like oil and water. The naphtha now contains the DMT and a little lye because the solubility of DMT in the basic bark water is so low. I would then carefully stick an oral syringe down into the jar and use my other hand to steady my syringe hand. Getting any of the bark water in the syringe would ruin the next step, so slowly, small amounts of naphtha would be siphoned out and shot into a cup for holding. The naphtha did not like being shot out of a syringe, though. Every time I needed to empty into the cup, the naphtha would come shooting out in bursts. And again, this left me, the counter, and the floor covered. This process also was repeated. 4 times I added fresh naphtha, shook the mixture onto my hands, vigorously washed, continued the cycle, and sucked out the fuel. I was getting down to the wire. It was 10:30 at this point, and I was getting paranoid. With every sound, I checked whether or not the front door was opening. I would repeatedly form 10-second cleanup plans in case Trevor got home early. Eventually, I had to compromise with my apprehensions and perform less naphtha pulls so I could finish in time. The DMT fuel was put into smaller glass canning jars filled up to the brim. They were going back into the freezer. My material was now in a different form, but with the same issue of visibility. I, as a degenerate, was not in the position to store glass jars filled with a clear liquid in the freezer with no questions asked. Luckily, I had been keeping a Tupperware container of red sauce in the freezer for months, and the jars were just small enough to fit in the container with the lid slightly cracked. After cleaning out the gravy, I was just able to fit 4 jars inside. I then buried the container underneath the frozen vegetable disguise. Trevor got home soon after I'd finished cleaning up. The stove, most of our pots, and some oven mitts were coated in bark muck. Every part was miserable, and every dish was time-intensive. I even had to mop because the bark had hardened to the kitchen floor. All the while, the entire apartment kept the smell of vinegar, mothballs, and gasoline that no amount of venting helped. Luckily, he never mentioned anything. The process had to be done quickly, otherwise the DMT would redissolve back into the naphtha as it warmed up. One by one, I took the jars out of the freezer, poured off the naphtha, and used a micro spatula to scrape the powder onto a filter. All the naphtha was saved to evaporate in a large casserole dish I would keep in my closet along with the drying DMT filter. The only problem was that my room was very enclosed, and the amount of fumes the naphtha was giving off made me think it would be dangerous to stay around for any prolonged period. Half the time the dish sat in my windowsill, otherwise I kept a lid on because the smell was making me both sick and paranoid. The DMT powder dried within an hour, but after 4 days of trying to evaporate the naphtha dish in a variety of windows and besides many fans to no success, I gave up. I figured whatever was left was not worth recovering. My lungs are awful at taking in smoke, and I never bothered to smoke enough to grow tolerance. Given that, I did not own a way to smoke the DMT. Many people online create their own pipe called the machine. I tried in the past to no success, but I gave it another attempt to avoid paying for a real piece. All the machine is a glass bottle with a hole in the bottom and a copper scrubber stuck in the neck. The better practice is to drill a hole through the bottle, but the poor man's way is to take a makeshift chisel to the bottom and hope for the best. Usually you buy a couple bottles because of how unpredictable the break of the bottle is when you are smashing it with a hammer. However, I only gave myself one chance. The cheapest glass I found at the store was a small and oblong bottle of vinegar, specifically chosen for the larger volume of smoke it could hold. I took to my old technique of sticking a screwdriver down the neck and hitting the top with a hammer. Living on the middle floor of the apartment, each hit of the hammer sent a loud noise throughout the building emanating from the floor of my kitchen. The amount of hits it took to break was worrying, given the attention I was bringing to myself. Eventually it did break, but in the worst way. Tiny glass shards were all across the floor, which I repeatedly stepped on even after I thought I had thoroughly cleaned. Months later, one last shard would appear while we had visitors, and it ended up in another person's foot. I had to pretend I didn't know exactly where it came from. The entire bottom came off. I would have to do the duct tape patch job. I attached a cone of tape to mend a large and jagged hole, but with just enough space to allow for a straw to enter the bottle and serve as the mouthpiece. And then the copper was cut from a larger piece of metal. It's exactly like steel wool, but copper. The only preparation needed was to torch the entire thing over the stove burner. This is to oxidize all the copper beforehand so you don't have to breathe any potential fumes when using. After bunching the copper up, sticking it in the neck, and screwing on the cap to the vinegar bottle, I was done. The thing looked awful. Exactly how it should. Half of the label was still stuck on, and what label was gone left glue that couldn't be scrubbed away. But I was committed, and more importantly, confident I could do a better job at smoking DMT than I did years ago. The machine functions by melting the DMT into the copper and then increasing the temperature to vaporize. The copper dramatically increases the surface area of the DMT around a material with high thermal conductivity, making it less likely to burn it. You initially load the machine upside down with the neck facing up, drop the DMT onto the scrubber, and then start torching the sides of the bottle around the area of the copper. By indirectly and evenly heating the copper via the glass, the DMT melts without vaporizing. Flip the machine over and start torching the coils from a few inches away, and the hot air of the torch will rise into the coils and vaporize the DMT. Smoke should begin to fill the machine. Once a large volume is reached, inhale through the straw, holding as long as possible. I started trialing low doses, putting 20 milligrams on at a time because I knew the combination of my smoking skills and my machine's quality would dramatically reduce the intake efficiency. It barely worked. Tons of smoke billowed out the seams of my duct tape solution. Everything smelled and tasted like duct tape. I couldn't hold the smoke in for long, and there was a trace amount of lye remaining in the DMT that was slightly burning my tongue. Apart from that, I was conflicted on the effects. The first trial, I had a sense of overwhelming peace. And same thing the next day. But after that, I smoked a larger amount that generated slight visuals and put me halfway into the psychedelic headspace. Feeling the effects, my first thought was, why did I want to do this? Not in my usual experience of psychedelic existential doom, but in not so enjoying the effects I did previously. I needed another way. While I could attempt to snort what I had, the leftover lye would make the experience miserable. Orally was the only good option, but to do so, an MAOI was needed to inhibit the enzyme normally preventing DMT from being psychoactive orally. In ayahuasca, this is usually done with Syrian rue or capi leaves, which contain harmala and harmaline, but for unknown reasons, someone was allowed to sell raw harmaline on Amazon, which is what I went with. Trials with harmaline alone would need to be done before I would feel comfortable enough to combine it with DMT. MAOIs were, and still are, used as antidepressants, so I was curious to see if it would make me feel better or if it would make me feel worse like the other antidepressants I've tried. It would also help having some familiarity to be able to separate the effects of the two once combined. The antidepressant effects did show up, and it was substantially different from other medications because of its immediate action. It incited slight mania, but it was extremely short-acting and not something I considered viable as a daily mood remedy. I also wanted to confirm something I saw on a forum where MAOI use can potentiate the effects of smoking and help achieve a breakthrough. With my poor smoking skills, I found no substantial effect at the lower doses I was trying. I was to start treatment the following week. This was very ideal timing. I didn't want to keep the DMT because I knew I wouldn't want to use much, but my thought was one last psychedelic experience before entering treatment could possibly give me the willingness to change. This was my plan for the day. Fast the night before to reduce the chances of throwing up, take the dose at 2 o'clock immediately after Trevor leaves for work, and then sit in the shower as the effects take hold. When I woke up, I wasn't nervous. I had tripped before, and this would be the last time for the foreseeable future. I ready 60 milligrams of DMT and 120 milligrams of harmaline in a shot glass full of orange juice. The citric acid of the orange juice should have neutralized any remaining base and converted any free base DMT to DMT citrate, so that my stomach acid wouldn't have to. Everything was ready by the time I heard Trevor exit the front door. I waited an additional 20 minutes in case he came back, and then I drank the majority. Drugs never taste good, but luckily this was a small amount of liquid. The empty stomach made the come up fast, so I got in the shower before the effects really settled in. But it was a very light trip, still very much within my control. My eyes were closed and there were two sides pulling on me, material and spiritual. I had to make a choice as to the direction of my life. I felt like I had been avoiding choices and responsibility in general because I didn't want to grow up, to face the consequences of the decisions you make without any possibility of restarting. I made the spiritual choice and sat with eyes closed, drifting through the fractals and faces. Only a half hour had passed and the effects were already starting to fade. I stepped out of the shower smiling, engrossed in my favorite part of the trip, the contented afterglow. Before I had gotten in the shower, I put the shot glass on the bathroom windowsill. There was still some liquid left, a small portion at the bottom where solids had settled out. I drank it and returned to my room. I felt so comfortable I thought I would do it the next day as well. By this time, I had not eaten in almost 24 hours, and I thought that with the come-up over, I could handle something light. I stumbled into the kitchen for a bag of pretzels and went on to watch Germa videos while lying in bed. He was playing GeoGuessr. As I ate pretzels, I found everything he said increasingly funny. I was laughing at the fact that I was laughing. The euphoria was increasing and I started to get lightheaded. I remembered reading a forum post about how someone found that eating bread intensified their trips. They theorized it was because it activated their stomach after a fast. Things began to feel too good. Almost all the visuals disappeared. I knew this feeling. and I knew what I felt now was only the start. Before the trip, I had measured out 2 milligrams of bromazepam into an oral syringe in case things went wrong. I reached out to my desk to grab it. I was practically nursing the syringe. The awful taste meant nothing. I needed to suck out everything I could. I crawled to the bathroom. I had too much shame to call another ambulance for myself. I was entirely convinced that I was going to die. Normally, I would get some kind of fear of death while in other trips, but this was in an intensely different way from those other experiences. Now, knowing what serotonin syndrome does, I felt like my heart was going to explode at any moment. The hot flashes were there, but there was no nausea. I was instinctually embracing the trash can and putting my face on the cold toilet bowl. I was too weak to move to the bath and run my forearm under cold water, constantly checking my pulse, waiting for my heart to stop, trying to prepare for the moment where I would have to do something in the last seconds of conscious life to make up for everything, for the situation I had brought on myself. I pled for the life I had wasted. I had failed, and I didn't want to die as a disappointment. Bargaining for a second chance, trying to stop what was inevitable, trying to find some set of perfect words that would rectify my life with God before death, trying to reassure myself that faith was enough, that asking for forgiveness was enough, but I only felt worse and more sure of death. It was as if I could hear the silence around me, and I became aware that I was alone. And then I realized what I was doing. I was an absolute failure. Out of everything you can fail in life, I had failed the one thing that matters. I was out of answers. I had no genuine faith, and I knew I was desperately groveling for my life. But I didn't care about God at all. It was still self-serving. I had perfect awareness of how I had been living my life, perfect awareness of everything I've done wrong and the consequences that I would soon face. Absolute conviction. I knew I wasn't in hell and that I was still alive, but I know this is what hell must feel like. I had never really thought about death. For so long, I had wanted to die or to not exist, but that desire was completely disconnected from the death I was conscious of at that moment. This experiential death was not within my control. It wasn't planned. It was the real death, inevitable and uncontrollable. No changing or fixing things. It is the permanent end. What would I be remembered for? If someone wrote my obituary, what is there to say? The remnant of a person lying on the ground had kept so much to himself that no one knew him, and every choice he made led to death. There is no person there, especially no person to be remembered. For a while, I was locked on the floor in the same state of uncertainty, still trying to fix. And then suddenly, I gave up. I was in no place to bargain for my life. I couldn't do anything. Everything began to calm down. I returned to my bed and passed out. For the next 2 days, I remained in bed, intermittently sleeping and hardly eating. I wasn't doing anything, and I wasn't thinking of anything. At 6 a.m., after staying up all night, what had happened days ago finally set in. Where could I even go from here? I felt broken and unsavable after I'd failed on a cosmic level. There wouldn't be any change. For years, my life was built around the fact that I wanted to die, but when truly facing death, I didn't. Lying in bed, unable to think, my mind was completely locked up, and all I could think was, I don't know anything.
I don't know anything. I don't know anything.
It was all I could repeat,
I don't know
endlessly
anything.
for who knows how long.
I don't know.
I tried to pray and felt worthless. I tried to rationalize and felt hopeless. I begged and pleaded for change, for an answer, for anything but silence. When I got up and looked in the bathroom mirror, I felt possessed. I was dissociating as much as ever. I entered treatment the following day.